Thank you. I'm Clem Beazold, and as you've heard, the co-founder with Nancy Donovan of the Public Sector Foresight Network and co-founder of the Institute for Alternative Futures. I'd like to say how honored I am to take part in this second conference on futures and strategy of Korea, particularly given the place that the National Assembly Foresight Institute, NAFI, plays as one of the leading foresight offices attached to a national legislature. And we appreciate NAFI's cooperation with and making presentations at our public sector foresight networks in recent years. So I'll be speaking about political and economic futures in the US post-COVID. So COVID will affect the economy, but it will do that largely by accelerating trends that are already occurring. And there are a variety of trends and counter trends that I want to present, and then I'll wrap those up into three different scenarios. And so in terms of the US economy, one basic question is, when will it recover? McKinsey has given us two scenarios that are useful to start with. One is a virus-controlled scenario that forecasts recovery within a year by most sectors, but lag in recovery, however, by important sectors: accommodations, food services, education services, arts, and entertainment. And in this, they note those sectors, and on the left, the white circles are the virus-contained scenario, but they also present a muted recovery scenario that argues that it may take up to 5 years for many sectors to get back to their 2019 level of GDP. And in the process, many of those, that's the band on the far right, are the share of small business sector of the GDP of that sector. And many small businesses will go under in either of these two scenarios. Another factor is federal government spending and revenues. The top dark line is spending, the bottom is revenues. The gap between them is a deficit. There will be hopefully another spike you see in the current moment from the next part of the stimulus. But the point is, this is that the government goes into the 2020s with a major debt, a debt that will be about 100% of the GDP. That hasn't happened since World War II, and it will shape priorities and how we deal with it. And it is a part of the political partisan divide that I'll talk about in a moment. But in terms of the economy, they're just fundamental trends shaping it. It's digitizing, dematerializing, and automating. When you put those together, that will disrupt many, many sectors. And it can lead to zero marginal cost production, which means that in many fields, services and products can be manufactured. The zero marginal cost of the next unit is zero or near zero. When that happens, prices will fall significantly. That's great news. On the other hand, making a profit in those sectors will become more difficult. The other aspect, fundamental trend in the economy, is that it's moving towards sustainability and equity, and that's really needed. A major indication of that is the pursuit of the UN Sustainable Development Goals by the players in the economy. The SDGs represent humanity's setting of targets for equity, particularly poverty reduction and sustainability. And that is reflected in a variety of corporate activities, including corporations that are getting behind environmental, social, and corporate governance, arguing that no firm can survive without a spirit of co-prosperity with society and the environment, and others that are working to build a new social contract that honors the dignity of every human being. This is needed in that in the 2020s, governments will need to step up payments such as guaranteed basic income, and the equity and sustainability supporting companies and the economy as a whole will need to generate value and profit sufficient to pay taxes to help fund these government expenditures. These transformations in the economy are significant for what they're doing to work and employment. The bottom line of this accelerated digitization and automation is that in the 2020s, between 15 and 40% of US jobs will be lost to automation. That's significant. Meanwhile, the place for work will continually shift to home and out of office. And COVID definitely has accelerated that. In the process, there's relocation of work and workers, in particular out of dense cities. Rents have fallen in San Francisco and New York, and as people have moved to other places. It's estimated that 23% of US workers could work from home 3 to 5 days a week without a drop in productivity. And so it's likely that there'll be some percentage of work at home that will be significant going forward. But the other, and that in this process, many jobs will continue to shift to gig work, lacking benefits and pay protections. The final aspect about changing work and employment is the fact that work is more than a paycheck. That's a quote that our President-elect Joe Biden has been saying often. He's quoting his father when his father lost his job and had to move the family. The Canadian government, the Policy Horizons Canada, which I've used their material for a variety of these trends, but they, looking at that, note that fewer jobs will challenge the way that people build meaning, relationships, status, connection to place and community, and the daily structure of their lives. So work is changing significantly. On the hopeful side, there's a cluster of technologies that I've come to call abundance advances. And that's changing production of materials, a lower cost production, a variety of biomaterials that can be used, 3D printing and other local production. This will lead to lower production costs, including cheap multi-purpose devices replacing many expensive goods and services. What this means is that low-income families will have the possibility for a lower cost of living provided by energy production and storage in homes or in their complexes, food production in communities or in their homes in a variety of ways, from high tech to community gardening, 3D printing and other local manufacturing of stuff they need, trading services and time among low-income families, enhanced community and self-reliance. In addition, the organizations can help promote these abundance advances. Housing authorities, property owners, community associations can develop solar parks and have begun to do that in the US, and other cost-reducing infrastructure, products, and services. Political partisanship is significant in the US and will remain that way. We'll see in a moment where it goes in these three scenarios, but the trends within that are the established Republican and Democratic differences, Republican red states versus Democratic blue states, with a heavy urban-rural divide in the process. As Nancy mentioned, and this politicizes many things, but that includes mask wearing and COVID public health protections have generally been opposed by Republicans in many settings. There's a structural advantage for Republicans in the Senate because each state gets 2 senators. Wyoming has 550,000 residents. California has 40 million. They both have 2 senators. Electoral college also structures the advantage so that you can win the presidential election without winning the popular vote, as President Trump did in 2016. White nationalism has been flavoring politics in recent years in significant ways. On the other hand, there's growing turnout. Biden got not 80 million votes, but 81 million votes by the latest count since I made these slides, and Trump got 74. That's the number 1 and number 2 turnout ever in American history, and the highest turnout rates in 100 years. Democrats and Republicans differ on a variety of positions, the ones listed there. and those remain relatively stable positions. On the other hand, demographics favor a long-term shifts to Democrats in that the Republican Party is predominantly white, the Democratic Party much more mixed. By 2045, whites will be a minority in the US, and so that demographics favors Democrats over the long term, with states like Arizona and Texas potentially turning blue. That's made more complex by the fact that, by the complexity within many minority groups. So for example, Hispanics the divide between Republicans and Democrats is higher for the Democrats, but there's been growing support even in the Trump election. The final long-term shift that affects political partisanship and is similar to some of the other trends is what I call equity rising. And in this context, it supports what Martin Luther King argued in saying that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And this is happening around the world, not only in the US, and the SDGs, I would argue, even represent that. But in the US, we've seen the civil rights movements, we've seen the identification of inequities and the discussion of inequities grow. Offices in state and local governments have created mechanisms explicitly ensuring fair racial and ethnic distribution of their programs and services. Black Lives Matter has become a dominant force, unfortunately driven by the repeated police killing of unarmed blacks. And finally, acknowledging systemic racism has become a factor. And again, this is a Republican-Democratic divide, with Democrats more easily acknowledging that. All of that's significant, and it reflects a changing mind and heart in the population as a whole. So when you put those together, we argue that you should have 3 or 4 scenarios. The first is expectable, the one in the middle, a zone of most likely conditions. The second is challenging, asks what could go wrong. The third is visionary or surprisingly successful. It explores aspirational space. So scenario 1, most likely, we have an economic recovery but slow growth. There's increased inequity with growing unemployment. You get politically the 50-50 swings between Republicans and Democrats. On the Republican side, there's an ongoing battle between the Ronald Reagan wing of the Republicans and the Donald Trump wings. Republicans add more Hispanics, other people of color, and in that regard, slow Democratic advances in the 2020s. Social programs and spending increase during the Biden administration, but then there are reductions in the later 2020s. There's little done about the debt. Tax increases do occur under the Democrats, but they're reversed under Republicans. And there's accelerated climate change controls in the early 2020s, but then those are slowed. So that's a likely political and economic forecast. Scenario 2 is challenging. And what could go wrong? Many things, but the COVID pandemic, this scenario assumes, is controlled in 2021, but slow economic recovery with many small businesses and cities going bankrupt. There's high job loss and significant shift to gig work. Extreme weather events, which occur in all the scenarios, but in this scenario, they're particularly intense and hit many regions of the US very hard. Social spending and taxes are increased in the early 20s with much pushback by the wealthy and those opposed to social spending. Hyperpartisanship grows in the 2020s, fueled by fake news, dark money, white nationalism, and in their combinations. Racial injustice grows, as does violent opposition to it and racial hatred. Republicans and Trumpism calls for law and order mirror those by Richard Nixon in the 1970s. Early in 2024, what could go wrong? Another pandemic, this time terrorist-made, one effectively spread through the US in January of 2024 that tanks the economy. That leads to the election of Trump 2, Donald Trump by 2024 in this scenario is in a New York State prison for some of his many offenses, but there are a variety of candidates in the US Senate, Republican senators and governors, who will step forward to be Trump 2 for the later half of the 2020s. That's scenario 2. Scenario 3, if you say, what would be visionary, surprisingly successful? That would be slow economic growth and faster automation occurring in the other scenarios, and rising gig work with unemployment. Zero marginal cost production does occur for many goods and services, lowering the cost of living. This mind and heart shift accelerates equity rising, the shifts in the economy and policy. Political polarization diminishes and white nationalism is reduced. There's growing support for progressive policies and taxation, including a universal income, basic income, which reshapes social policy and personal contribution. Corporations and businesses continue to evolve in this equity supporting economy, and their coordinated climate change policies. The abundance advances, those low-cost energy, food, locally produced stuff, and services sharing do lower the cost of living, particularly for low-income families. So those are the three scenarios that come from this evolving set of trends in the economy and politics. Thank you. If you'd like more information, my email is there, and I appreciate the opportunity to make this presentation.